welcome folks. My name is Jez. I am the Adult and Teen Programming Librarian here at the Elmhurst Public Library. Just going to go over a couple of things before we get started. I want to mention a few programs coming up. On Wednesday at 6 p.m., we have Journaling for Self-Care. So you'll be able to make your own journal using all of our wonderful craft supplies. And our social worker will be talking about different forms of self-care as well as the power of writing. So we have a couple of spots left for that one. And then also on Wednesday at 7 p.m., we have Fantastic Food First. So our summer theme has been all about food. We've teamed up with the Elmhurst History Museum for that. They have an exhibit on Chicago's iconic foods right now that you should all go check out. It'll be there until October. So theirs goes a little bit longer than ours, but also I don't need an excuse to offer lots of food programs because I know we all love them, especially when we have some food to eat afterwards, which we will tonight. So the Fantastic Food First is going to be all about the iconic firsts that have happened. So where was the first ice cream sundae and who invented the marshmallow? So we'll have a performance for that one, and it'll be a lot of fun. As I mentioned, we are doing all food things right now. So we're doing that tonight. We are using the webinar version, which means you can see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. Our baker here will be taking questions throughout. So if you put those in the chat or the Q&A, I can relay those to him. So if you have questions at any time, since it is a bake along. And yeah, I think that's all we need to do for this because we're only doing virtual today. We're not doing the hybrid this time because you all are at home in your kitchens. So I will introduce our speaker here. So William Reekman is Bill the Baker and has been baking bread for over 50 years. He teaches classes at libraries all over the place, does some online ones that I'm sure he'll tell you about a little bit as well. And even though I know your true passion is bread, you're going to branch out a little bit and help us with scones tonight. So welcome.
Thank you, Jess. You're turning it over to me now, Jess?
Yes, it's all you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And welcome, everybody. I would like to say welcome to my kitchen, but we're not in my kitchen tonight. We're actually doing this class from Toronto, Canada. I'm in the kitchen of one of my children. I do teach baking classes. I've been teaching classes for the last 9 years, 6 years. They were live classes. And then, of course, when COVID hit, I switched over to Zoom. And I am currently teaching all of my classes in the Zoom environment with the exception of libraries. For those of you that are attending tonight, I do not have your email address. I do not know who you are. But what I do offer to the people who attend library classes is the opportunity to experience one of the Zoom classes at no cost. The normal cost for the Zoom classes for an adult is $25. I do give you the opportunity to attend a class for free since you came to the library presentation tonight. In order for me to get you a ticket for free, you need to see my schedule. And in order to see my schedule, you need to send me your email address. So for those of you that are out there that are interested in attending a class for free, you can send an email. I'll give you a minute to get a paper and pen or pencil. My email address is B like in Bill, REICHMAN @sbcglobal.net. And that B Reichman is all one word. There's no period in between it. So it's B Reichman @sbcglobal.net. I do not sell your emails. I do not share your email addresses with anybody. And you have the opportunity to unsubscribe from my once a month class schedule mailing anytime that you want to. After you send me your email address, you will start receiving my schedule. And when you see a class that you would like to try, just send an email back to me telling me that you were in the library presentation tonight from Elmhurst, and I will put you into the class. I believe somebody just, Jez just typed the email in the chat window. If you're going to submit questions through Jez, just give Jez a minute to read those questions, because I won't be able to see the screen without constantly leaning in, and I really don't want to do that to you. My classes all run in the same format. When you sign up for a class, you'll receive an email with instructions on what you need to do to prepare yourself for the class. You'll get a copy of the recipe. Of course, you have to shop for your own ingredients. And included in the email I send you is the Zoom link so that you can attend the Zoom class. I always run the classes with the same format. You come to the class, I assume, to learn a recipe. My intentions once you get into class are completely different from teaching you a recipe. My interest is in teaching you the science of baking. My belief is, number one, baking is very much a science. And number two, the more you understand the science, the more in control you are of the process and the quality of the things that you are baking. So I try to teach you the science and work as much science into the class. Sometimes that science is simply just an explanation of something that's taking place. And I'm hoping that I will give you good habits to follow, and I will give you the ability to recognize when something is going wrong and what needs to be done to fix it. In the email that was sent out for tonight's class, you were instructed to have either a food processor or a pastry blender, pastry cutter. Those of you that are using a pastry cutter, excuse me, those of you using a pastry cutter tonight, it will go a little bit slower for you, but you'll be able to catch up and finish the class with us at the same time. So let's go over the format that we use in the class. The first thing I do is go over the tools that are going to be used during the class. So in this class, I happen to have a sharp knife that I'm going to use to cut the scones. I have a small silicone spatula that I will use to scrape the bottom of the container of my food processor. I always bake with a bowl scraper. It's a flexible scraper. It's got a curved edge so that it can conform to the inside edge of a bowl. I'm going to use an old Cool Whip container. If you don't have an old plastic container of about this size, it's about 5 inches across the bottom. I'm looking for a container where the sides go more straight up and down, as opposed to a bowl where the sides really flare out. I'm going to use this to help shape the dough after it's made. I'm going to finish making the dough in this bowl so that you can, I used glass so that you can see through it. We will start with a food processor, and then I have a cookie sheet covered with some parchment paper. I also have a silicone mat on the counter. I'm going to switch the camera so that you can see my counter. I have a cutting board as well that I will use to cut the scones because I don't want to cut on my silicone mat. For those of you that are baking with me, you should turn your oven on to 425 degrees with a shelf in the middle of the oven. I'll give you a second in case you need to get some tools out. My food processor is right here. It's off camera right now. We will bring that into focus in a few minutes. I'm going to bring my cutting board back. The instructions told you that you were going to be making cranberry apricot scones, and that you should cut your apricots, these are dried apricots, cut them into small pieces. Most of these pieces are about the size of the head of a match. This is what the dried apricot looked like before it was cut into pieces. I'm going to show you how I cut them into those small pieces. I first take the apricot and cut it into slices. Then I take those slices and cut them into small pieces. One of the things that a recipe, I don't believe any recipe ever tells you, but it's certainly something that's important for you to keep in mind when you are baking. The size of the ingredients are important to the person who's going to be eating whatever it is you are baking. And the reason for that is the size of the ingredient will have an impact on the interaction with your palate when you start eating it. If I had left those apricots into large pieces or the whole apricot and used the whole apricot, a couple of your bites would have had an apricot flavor, and the rest of the bites would not have had an apricot flavor at all. So keep in mind, the size of the ingredients will have an impact on the eating process of what you are baking. So for those of you baking with me using a food processor, I suggest that you start by adding your flour, your sugar, your baking powder, and your salt. For those of you using a pastry blender, put all of those ingredients that I just mentioned, which was flour, sugar, baking powder, and salt, put them into a mixing bowl and whisk the ingredients to incorporate them. With the food processor, I'm simply going to hit the pulse button a few times to get those ingredients to mix together. 3 or 4 times of pulsing should be all that you need to do. The next thing I'm going to do is take the frozen butter out of the freezer and take the heavy cream out of the refrigerator. I want those ingredients cold. We'll go over that later while the scones are in the oven baking. I'll show
We
you.
do have a question.
Yes,
Is it a half cup each of apricots and cranberries or half cup mixed?
I'm using probably, I'm going to guess when I combine these two together, it's probably 3/4 of a cup.
Great, thank you.
And that is certainly something that you can adjust up and down to your liking. So I've cut the butter. This is the frozen butter. I'm adding the frozen butter to my food processor. If you're using a pastry blender, go ahead and add the frozen butter cubed to your bowl with the dry ingredients and start cutting with the pastry blender. As you are cutting with the pastry blender, you'll see chunks of butter starting to build up between the blades. Periodically scrape those pieces of butter out, because the whole purpose of that pastry blender is to cut those pieces smaller, and if they're stuck between the blade, they won't be getting any smaller. For those of you using a food processor, you're going to pulse the food processor. I do that by pressing down and counting to 3 slowly. I'm going to pulse the food processor probably 6 or 8 times. I'll start with 6 and then check the butter to see how it looks. And if it needs more, I will do more. So if you have a food processor, start pulsing. If you have a pastry blender, then go ahead and start cutting up and down with the pastry blender. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, that's 1. 1, 2, 3, that was 2. 1, 2, 3, that's 3. 1, 2, 3, that's 4. 1, 2, 3, that's 5. 1, 2, 3, that's 6. So now I'm going to peek inside and take a look. I'm looking to see that I do not have large chunks of butter. I'm going to take out a large chunk of butter to show you what I define a large chunk of butter to be. That is way too big. So I'm going to continue the pulsing process. I'm going to do 3 more times. 1, 2, 3, 1. 1, 2, 3, 2. 1, 2, 3, 3. Now, the reason we're pulsing the food processor rather than running it continuously is we don't want the blade to heat up. We heat up the blade, it'll start melting the butter. I still see a couple of bigger chunks of butter, so I'm going to do this 3 more times. If you're using the pastry blender, just keep cleaning that blender out and keep chopping until your butter, the big pieces of butter disappear. Okay, I'm going to do 3 more times. 1, 2, 3, 1. 1, 2, 3, 2. 1, 2, 3, 3. Okay, I think we've reached the point there might be 1 or 2 pieces of butter in here that's still sizable, but I can accept 1 or 2 pieces of butter being large. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take those dry ingredients out of my food processor. Get the food processor out of the way of the camera. I'm just going to empty the food processor container into my mixing bowl. I haven't put anything else in here yet. It's still just the dry ingredients and the butter. Then I'm going to add my cranberries and my apricots. I'm not going to mix them in. I'm going to leave them on top. And that's intentional. And I'm going to pour the heavy cream, and I'm going to try to get as much of it on top of the dried fruit as I can. And I'm doing that because I want the dried fruit to become wet. We're going to be incorporating that dried fruit in with the flour. And if it's wet, it will be sticky. And we'll have a much better chance of keeping that fruit in the batter when it's wet. I'm going to use the bowl scraper next. If you don't have a bowl scraper, you can use a very stiff silicone spatula. And what I'm going to be doing is just going up and down through this dry ingredients, wet ingredients, and dried fruit. And I'm just chopping up and down.
Did you cut the cranberries into smaller pieces?
I did not, no.
Thanks.
Okay. As you start chopping up and down, if you're using a bowl scraper, you'll see that you'll start to accumulate large pieces of wet dough. Periodically slice that off. And I will show you in a few minutes why we keep slicing it or taking it off of the food, the bowl scraper. Just keep chopping up and down. If you're using a silicone spatula, clean that off once in a while because you're probably getting dough sticking to it as well. Periodically reach down to the bottom of the bowl and bring the dry ingredients, which is where they are hiding. Bring those dry ingredients back up to the top. And then just keep slicing through the wet ingredients, allowing the dry ingredients to fall back down. Don't forget, reach down to the bottom, bring those dry ingredients back up to the top. I'm going to intentionally stop early, stop the mixing process early. I want to show you what it looks like if you were to stop too early, thinking that you were done, and you really weren't done. I want to show you what's going to happen. Your next process, when you're done, remember, I'm doing this because I incorrectly thought I was done. Your next process is to push the dough down into the bowl with your fist. When you get it packed down, use the spatula or the bowl scraper to separate the sides from the bowl and attempt to lift the dough out in one piece. If you had mixed it properly, you would be able to reach down here and actually lift this out in one piece. But as you can see, it's just falling apart to pieces because remember, I stopped prematurely just to show you what it would look like. So when that happens to you, just continue your mixing process, the chopping up and down. Remember to dig down to the bottom, get those dry ingredients off the bottom and up to the top. I'm getting real close here. One or two more times, flipping it over, and I'll be done. Yeah, I'm done. So now I'm going to show you what it looks like when you have mixed it properly. Remember, I'm going to pack it down with my fist. Packing it down hard. Then I'm going to use the bowl scraper to separate the side a little bit. And now when I try to lift this out as one piece, the dough comes out as one piece stuck together. I'm going to now take that dough and force it down into that container that I had with the straight sides. If you did not have a Cool Whip container to use, you can just leave the disc shaped the way it came out of the bowl. And I will show you what to do next. If you have a Cool Whip container and your dough is ready to be shaped, pack it into the Cool Whip container as tightly as you can. And I will wait a few minutes to give those of you that are baking with me a chance to catch up. I will also tell all of you that at this point, if you did not want to bake tonight, you could put a cover on this, put it into your refrigerator, and tomorrow morning, you're about 20 minutes away from having fresh scones. We are about 20 minutes away from having fresh scones tonight. Yes, the ovens are lit. I was just asked if I had my oven on. If there's anybody out there that needs more time, if you don't mind, just send a quick message to Jez and I will hold up a little longer.
We do have a question.
Yes.
Why do you mix with the dough scraper instead of a spoon?
It's a great question. And as soon as we get these in the oven, I'm going to answer that question. It doesn't look like anybody's asking for more time. So what I'm going to do next is bring over my cookie sheet with my parchment paper. I'm going to just squeeze the edges of the bowl a little bit so that the dough separates from the sides of the container. And then if I plop it down, I get a disc that is much closer to what I want the scone disc to look like at the start. So I'm going to press this down now because it's a little too high. And I'm using my bowl scraper to press the sides in as I press the top down. And it's just packing everything in the disc a little bit tighter. I want it to be about 6 inches across. If it's 6 inches across, it has to be the right thickness. We all started out with the same volume, so if it's 6 inches across, it can only be so high. I'm going to take this disc, run the knife right through the middle, and when I get down to the bottom, I'm going to twist the blade side to side, and as I do that, it separates 2 halves of the dough. I'm going to turn the dough 90 degrees. I'm going to slice each half into half again, and again, I'm going to twist side to side, and as I do that, the 4 pieces of dough start to move away from each other. I'm going to take each of the 4 pieces, the quarters, and cut it into half. And again, as I get to the bottom, I twist side to side. And I now have 8 pieces of scone. This cutting it into 8 makes a pretty generous scone. If you have a larger group to feed, or you don't want scones quite as large, then my suggestion is you cut that disc, that 6-inch disc, into 10 pieces rather than 8. If you think of that disc as the face of a clock, if you cut every 6 minutes, you'll end up with 10 pieces because there are 60 minutes in the hour going around the clock. So you make a cut at the 6-minute mark, the 12-minute mark, the 18-minute mark, etc. Make sure that you give space between your scones because they're going to get larger. I'll give you a minute to get ready to put these in the oven, and then we'll go back and answer some of the questions about why we did what we did. My oven is up to temperature. I'm going to put this in the oven on the middle shelf And I'm going to set a timer for 15 minutes. I suggest you all start with a 15-minute timer. And the reason I suggest 15 minutes is I'm guessing that this is the first time any of you are baking with me. And one of the things we definitely learned about doing these classes is everybody's oven bakes at a different temperature. So I'll give you all a minute to get yours into the oven. Now would be the time to start submitting questions to Jez. And if we don't get questions, I'll go back and answer the one that we had as to why we're using a bowl scraper.
All right, no questions so far.
Okay. In order to answer the question about why did we use a bowl scraper, it's best to go back and look at what is actually in that white powder that we called wheat flour that we used 2 cups of. If you were to look at the label on wheat flour, specifically King Arthur flour, if you'll hang on one second, I will get a bag and show you. This happens to be bread flour, which is not what I used tonight. I used King Arthur all-purpose flour, but King Arthur flour, all of them have a number in the upper right-hand corner of the face of the bag. This one is 12.7%. And underneath it, it says 12.7% of gluten-forming protein content. There really is no gluten in wheat flour. The gluten gets developed when you go through the mixing, also known as the kneading process. So 12.7% of this bag is protein. The rest is starch. The all-purpose flour, I believe, is down around 11%. And then you have cake flour with less and pastry flour with even less. 11% versus 12.7% doesn't sound like a big difference. But if you think about chewing on a piece of Italian bread versus a piece of cake, I'm guessing that the Italian bread had to be chewed many times, while the cake, you were lucky to be able to chew it once before it disappeared in your mouth. What you are chewing on in both cases is gluten. And gluten is what gets developed, in this case, with 12.7% of this bag having been protein. It's the proteins that develop gluten. So when the proteins bump into each other and they're wet, they stick together. And as more and more proteins bump into the ends of the other proteins, you end up with strings of protein. And that strings of protein is called gluten. So keep that, the gluten thought in mind. And now let's go back and talk about what we did with the bowl scraper. If you think of my fist as a very wet piece of dough, it starts out, it's a handful of heavy cream in the bowl, and it's all it is heavy cream. And I cut through that heavy cream and the dry ingredients fall down. As I cut through that heavy cream, it opened up, and now I have dry ingredients hitting the inside on both sides of where I just sliced. Remember, I kept telling you to bring up the dry ingredients and put it on top. We were slicing through wet ingredients, slicing through, and it opens up. And each time you slice through and open up, two sides get exposed that are more damp than the surrounding outside edge of that before you slice it. And that's what enables the dry ingredients to hit a damper surface and be absorbed into your dough. So when we did that, we were manipulating the proteins as little as possible because we do not want the scones to have protein. That was the reason we chose the all-purpose flour. We have to have some protein, some gluten to hold it together, but we don't want our scones to be chewy like a piece of Italian bread. Donna, set a timer for 13 minutes. Excuse me, I have to get a timer set. We do not want the scones to be chewy. We want it to be flaky. So let's go back and look at the other ingredients that we used, primarily the frozen butter. Remember that the bag had 12.7% protein. If it was all-purpose flour, it was down around 11%, and the rest of it was starch. So when you get a piece of starch and another piece of starch, and you get them wet, and you press them together, and then press them thin, you end up with a potato chip. A potato chip is potato starch that's baked very thin. When you take frozen butter and you put it into the batter, you have a piece of starch and a piece of starch, and there's a piece of frozen butter in between them. They're not able to stick to each other. When that piece of frozen butter starts to heat up in the oven, because the butter contains water, as the butter heats up, it starts to give off the water. As the water gets hotter, it turns into steam. So what I have now is I have pieces of starch separated by pieces of butter, but as that butter melts, the water melts, as the water turns into steam, I end up with steam generators throughout the inside of my scone, pushing starches away from each other. So by pushing those starches away, I end up with a scone that is much flakier rather than chewy or crispy like a potato chip. By introducing some fat into that environment, I also am separating the starch with the fats coming from the butter and the heavy cream, and it keeps those pieces of starch away from each other. And again, I end up with a much flakier scone. So any other questions on the ingredients and why we handled them the way we did? Also, using this kept our hands out of the bowl. And by keeping our hands out of the bowl, we kept the heat of our hand out of the bowl, so that frozen butter had a much better chance of staying frozen in small pieces.
We have a question. Is it okay to use other brands of all-purpose flour?
Absolutely. It's just a question of the reason I use the King Arthur flour, and I'm not here trying to endorse King Arthur flour. You have the right to use whatever kind of flour you want. I know that I never have a failure when I use King Arthur flour. And the use of King Arthur flour goes all the way back 9 years ago when I was teaching live classes. I couldn't risk having 20 or 30 people in a class and having 20 or 30 people getting things out of the oven that failed. I knew the consistency of this number. I could count on this number being consistent with King Arthur flour. If you read the words that are on this bag, King Arthur stands by the fact that they are consistent with their measurement of protein. All-purpose flour of other brands will work fine. You may find that the quality or the consistency of what you're making changes as you go from bag of flour to bag of flour. And if that's happening, it's because the protein is changing from one bag to the next. So that was the reason for the King Arthur flour.
Elaine wants to know, can she use salted butter and then reduce the ½ teaspoon of salt in the recipe?
Yes, you can. And depending on the brand of butter, you have to find out how much salt is in one stick of butter, and then reduce that ½ teaspoon down. If you don't want to go through the process of finding how much salt is in there, I think you're very safe by reducing it down to1/4 teaspoon. Use salted butter and 1/4 teaspoon of salt.
How wet of an ingredient can you use in place of the dried fruit? For example, can you use nuts or fresh fruit?
You can use fresh fruits carefully. Let's talk about blueberries. Actually, let's go back to the other handout that came with the email that you got from the library. And it listed probably 8 or 10 different scones that I make. I make those scones with the exception of the strawberry scones that are on that list. The rest of them are made with the same recipe that you used tonight, or that maybe you didn't use, but you have it in front of you. And I believe you'll see some of the ingredients have an asterisk next to them. That asterisk is the base recipe for scones that I use. And then I just change the flavor components of the recipe. My policy with recipes is you are welcome to any recipe I have. You don't have to attend a class to get a recipe. My goal is to get you to bake. And the reason my goal is to get you to bake is baking has been such an enjoyable part of my life. I'm hoping that I can convince others to get the same level of enjoyment from baking that I do. I do have a website called billthebaker.com. If you go to that website, you'll see a link on the top for recipes. There's probably 40 or 50 recipes on the website now. If there's a recipe that you want that is not on the website, there's a button on the website to contact me. It just sends me an email, and I will be more than happy to send you the missing recipe if I have the recipe that you're looking for. So the base recipe allows you to change the flavor components. You have to be somewhat careful. And I'm going to use blueberries because that's I'm going to say it's the worst example, but it's the best example. Fresh blueberries are like tiny little water balloons. And when those water balloons are inside of your scone, they will break open. The problem is if you use fresh blueberries and you're going through that slicing with the dough, you're just going to be slicing blueberries open constantly. And by the time you get done mixing the dough, you have sliced all the water balloons open and your dough is probably blue in color. So to prevent that from happening, what I suggest you do is you wash, dry, and then freeze the fresh blueberries with a little bit of flour, maybe a teaspoon or two of flour in the bag, so that the blueberries stay apart from each other when they are frozen. When you are going through the process of cutting the cream into the dry ingredients, I would hold off a little bit and then add the blueberries about halfway through that process. I've used fresh strawberries without freezing them. I've used apples without freezing them. It's the one that is really very wet. Peaches, I'd be concerned with peaches because peaches are so full of water. I would freeze the peaches and then use the peaches the way I did the blueberries. Suggested you use them the way I did the blueberries. Okay?
And then what steps would you recommend for round scones?
Do the same thing we did tonight, and then use a round or circular cutter. Cut as many circles as you can out of the disc. Gather the excess dough back up, reshape it and cut it again. But as you are doing that, you're going to put the heat of your hand on it. So you do it as quickly as you can. And you should be able to get it. You should be able to use all of the dough up. The last piece is probably just taking the circular cutter, putting it on the counter, putting the loose pieces of dough into it and pressing it back down, and then take the ring off that last piece.
All right, and how will scones be affected if we omit adding yeast?
There was no yeast in here. This was baking powder. So there was no yeast in the scones tonight. So
Okay,
you don't
I think we're
you
good
don't
to
want
move
to
on.
use, I'm sorry?
I think we're good to move on.
Okay, so that being said, you would not want to use self-rising flour if you were making scones. There are bags of flour sold in the food stores called self-rising flour, and I would avoid using those for scones. So let's go back to the name of that website one more time. It's Bill the Baker, all one word, billthebaker.com. And across the top, you'll see tabs. You'll see tabs for my events calendar where you'll see my classes a month at a time. You'll see some of my library classes, the ones that I'm allowed to advertise. Some libraries don't want me to promote the class through my website, but the ones that I can promote, I promote, and they're free to the public. The library really doesn't care where you live.
So Mary Ellen says it's been 15 minutes and her bell rang. How does she know if it's done?
The edges will have a brownish color to them. And you want to check the bottom of the scone to make sure it's not getting too dark. The butter content of these scones has a tendency to darken the bottom if you cook them too long. I will take mine out of the oven very shortly. As soon as somebody comes back and tells me that the timer has gone off. The person manning my clock has left the room. I'll show you what mine look like. The problem with the internet is that it doesn't really show color well. I'm using the wrong camera. Let me switch the camera real quick. That's the bottom of that's what the scone should look like on the bottom. And then on the top, you should see brown along the edges. I can tell you that the edges are much browner than they're showing up on the camera. And these scones are cooked the way they should be cooked or baked. Yep. Okay. Somebody just told me my timer was off. So what I'm going to do next is allow these to cool. For these scones, I prefer to dust them with powdered sugar. I'll dust one now prematurely just to show you what it looks like. I say prematurely because with them being as hot as they are, that sugar is not going to stay on there very long. It'll just disappear. but I want you to see what they look like. So here's what it looks like without the sugar. And that's what it looks like with the sugar. I just think it's a much more attractive scone with the powdered sugar on it. Some of the other scones that you have on that list have different kinds of glazes. Typically, the glaze is made with powdered sugar and maybe a lemon juice or a milk or a cream. The lemon basil scones certainly have a lemon glaze on it. I don't believe I have too many that I leave just plain. I just think they're more attractive with something on top. Any other questions?
We have a couple here.
Okay.
Follow up from earlier. What would happen if you didn't add baking powder?
They wouldn't rise. They wouldn't get bigger.
And then Allison was looking at some of the other recipes on your website and wants to know, where do you find cinnamon chips?
That's a great question. They are a seasonal item in the food stores. They're sold in the baking section, right next to the chocolate chips. You probably have walked past them hundreds of times and not even recognized that they were actually cinnamon chips rather than chocolate chips. They're not in the stores yet, but they'll be coming in within a month or so. You might find them in Illinois, you might find them at Woodman's now. But the rest of the stores probably will not have them. What I suggest you do, if you like cinnamon, you'll probably love the Cinnamon Crunch Scones. Buy a couple of bags of those cinnamon chips, because they will last you all year in your cabinet, and you'll be enjoying Cinnamon Crunch Scones throughout the year rather than just at the holiday time. And the other tip that I would give you is the more, let me back up. To make the Cinnamon Crunch Scones, before you put them in the oven to bake them, you are going to brush on melted butter and then sprinkle cinnamon and sugar over the top. And the more cinnamon and sugar you sprinkle over the top, the more crunch you will have on your Cinnamon Crunch Scone. I'm just going to get these away from the countertop. There's two very large dogs in this home that would love to be eating those scones. And I don't want to have to keep watching the dogs. Hang on one second.
Another attendee said that they found the cinnamon chips today at Walmart.
Perfect. So they're in there now. As I said, when you find them, buy them. They will last all year. And you won't go through the disappointment of being in the spring and not having cinnamon chips to work with. Whoop. Somebody's asking for a scone.
The only other question I have right now is, can you talk to us about your Made in France prep board?
My Made in France, what is it?
Prep board.
Crepe?
Preparation.
The Made in France.
I'm assuming they saw it on screen somewhere.
I'm not sure what they saw. We made crepes, French crepes, but I don't know what's the secret about preparation.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they could give us a better question.
Yeah. All right, well, if there are any other questions, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll pass those along.
And you can, now that you have my email address, you have the right to email me anytime you have a question. As I said, my goal is to get you to bake, and I don't mind being friendly to people and answering questions. I answer questions all the time. I love doing it. I love sharing this passion with all of you. It's never looked upon as a nuisance or an interruption to my schedule, just send me an email and I'll be happy to answer your questions. And once you attend one of my classes, then you'll have my phone number, because that comes with the instructions as well. People call me all the time.
So it looks like they want to know about the board in front of you, the roll pat on the counter.
Oh, the silicone mat. This is you buy these at Amazon, of course. Bed Bath & Beyond. I believe this one was purchased at Bed Bath & Beyond. They come in all different sizes. I would give you a word of advice. I wouldn't buy anything bigger than this. This is actually a little bit bigger than I would want it to be. This is my son's. And the reason I say don't buy it too big is you have to wash it after you're done using it. And when you wash it, then you have to dry it. And as it gets bigger and bigger, it becomes more and more cumbersome to try to dry without making a mess of your kitchen. So I would keep them, within about 24 inches, 18 by 24, something like that. People do bake on them. You can use this instead of parchment paper. I don't bake on it, but I find that the life gets extended. This one's probably 12 or 14 years old at this point. If you take care of it, it'll last forever. One word of advice, don't cut on it with a knife. If you remember tonight, I cut the scone into pieces when the scone was on top of the cookie sheet. Never cut on your silicone mat. You'll just cut it right into pieces. Any other questions?
No other questions, but we do have a comment from Mary Ellen. I think it's a good one to end on. They say, I have been wanting to make scones all my life and they taste amazing, which surprises me since I don't consider myself a baker, and you made it easy and fun and changed my love of baking.
Wonderful. Made my day.
Looks like we got one more question. What is the best method to reheat the scones?
Take a paper towel. First of all, you won't have to reheat them tonight. Tomorrow morning, you probably will. If you're going to keep them till tomorrow, let them come to room temperature, put them in an airtight container or a Ziploc bag. Tomorrow, take a piece of paper towel, one sheet of paper towel, dampen it, wrap the paper towel around the scone and put it in the microwave for about a minute, and it should heat it up and freshen it up again from the dampness of the paper towel.
All right, and someone else said that they turned out perfectly. Thank you.
I'm so glad. I haven't had any failures with these scones, to be honest with you. They are always a crowd pleaser, and people are always amazed at how easy they are to make when they see it being done. When I have the desire to have a scone in my house for breakfast, when I walk into the kitchen with nothing being taken out before I got there, 30 minutes later, we're eating scones. Because it may seem like it took a lot longer tonight, and that's because I was doing all that talking. When you're not doing all that talking and you just go into your kitchen, take the ingredients out, mix it together and pop it into the oven, that doesn't take more than 15 minutes, especially if you keep frozen cubed butter in your freezer. If you were to go into my freezer at home and open it up, you would find bags of frozen butter, because I use frozen butter for a number of recipes, and that they all happen to be 5 tablespoons. And having a couple of bags of frozen cubed butter in the freezer, you're always ready to go.
All right, looks like we have one more question. How large of a food processor do you recommend?
I don't know how they are To be honest with you, I don't know how they are sized. This one is, this is the Cuisinart and it says 11 on it, but it's so old. All it says is prep 11 plus, and I don't know the size. This looks like it's probably 2 quarts. You could probably put 2 quarts of milk in here, maybe 2.5 quarts. I do have a much smaller one that does not work for scones. I don't even know why we have that much smaller one. It sits in a closet and it's never used. And if yours is bigger than this, it will still work fine. Just remember, the bigger it is, chances are it's stronger, meaning the motor is stronger. And you may find that it cuts that butter up faster than what you saw happening tonight. So just keep that in mind. You don't want the butter cut into too small of pieces, because then you start risking losing those steam generators. Anything else, Jez?
That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. I appreciate you coming. Jez, I appreciate you setting this up for us. And I hope I get to meet some of you someday in a class. If not, I'm an email away. Just send me your questions and I'll be happy to answer them for you. And Jez, I really do appreciate you setting this up for me.
Yes. Can you talk for a moment about the other classes that you teach?
Sure, absolutely. I teach.
Folks missed it at the beginning.
That's okay. I teach. Now you've opened up Pandora's box when you've asked me to talk, because I can really talk. I have 2 types of classes that I teach. I teach the adult classes, like the one you just had tonight. I don't allow more than 20 people in the class, but they always average around 10 to 12 people. And the reason for that is I can see everybody on the screen as long as it's 19 or less. And it allows me to pay attention to what's going on in your kitchen. So if I see something wrong, or if I see you doing something wrong, I can correct it before it becomes a problem. So I teach adult classes. I started out as just really baking breads. That's all. I loved breads because of the way I was brought up. But I loved making breads. I started teaching the public, and they wanted more than breads. So we started doing things like scones and bagels, donuts, cakes, cookies. And then I ran into children. And I really ran into children when COVID hit. I started to do a free class on the internet for children to give them something to do while they were locked into their homes. And I ended up doing almost 200 classes. They ended up going into 6 different countries. And I think that at the final count, there were 198 families that had participated in those classes. But out of that effort came something that we now call the Children's Advanced Baking Skills class. It's free to children, but it's not open to the public. It's by invitation only, meaning my invitation. If you have a youngster, the youngest in the class started at 8. Actually, he started when he was 5. And he was at 5 years old, this little boy was a rock star. And I think the oldest was around 13. When they get a little bit older than 13 or 14, they tend to start not wanting to be in the class anymore because of the younger children. So anywhere from, say, 5 to 13 years of age would qualify. All I'm looking for are children that are there because they wanted to be there to learn how to bake, not because their parents said you really have to do these classes. The children that are in my classes, right now there's 21 families that participate. I usually end up with 8 or 10 children every weekend. To be part of the group, you do not have to come every weekend. You just have to follow a few simple rules when you do come. And the rules really are just being polite to each other and coming with an interest in improving your baking skills. So I do children's classes, I do the adult classes. If you have a child that you think would qualify, you have my email address. Just write me a little email describing what it is you think this child, or why you think this child should be in the class. I'll write you back. We'll go back and forth once or twice. And if we both end up agreeing that the child should be in the class, then I put them in the class. As I said, there's no cost to them, and they do not have to be there every weekend. I know these children all have other things. We have horseback riders, we have golf, soccer, baseball, hockey. Got one girl she's a star on her hockey team. I know that the children have other things in life besides baking, but when they come to the class to bake, they come to class because they really wanted to be there, and they're like sponges. I mean, they just absorb everything that I say. And those children forced me way out of my comfort zone 2 years ago. They wanted a whole month of cakes, which I was never really a cake baker. And then they wanted candy, and we did a month of candy. And ever since then, I've incorporated candies and cakes in my classes. So those are the kinds of classes that I teach. I try to get at least one bread class in per month.
Looks like we had a 9-year-old with us tonight.
Well, that's wonderful. If that 9-year-old thinks they should be in my advanced class, get your parent to send me an email. You have my email, breichman@sbcglobal.net. That it, Jez?
That's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thanks again. And hopefully I'll see some of you in another class at some point in the future. Enjoy your scones.
Have you back.
Take care.
Bye.